Okay, so the third line of evidence that I'm going to talk about and spend the most time on is the human fossil record. And there have been some pretty substantial changes in the course of the 150 years since the publication of the Origin of Species. So what I've put on the board here is what we knew about the hominin fossil record at the time of the origin of the species. And so we have ourselves and we have Neanderthals, Homo neanderthalensis. And today we have a much more diverse fossil record. We have thousands of specimens. My colleagues have been very busy collecting fossils over the last 150 years, and we now have a really quite impressively rich fossil record for the hominin lineage. And as we'll see, it potentially goes all the way back to 7 million years. Okay? And depending on who you talk to in terms of researchers, there's something between half a dozen and 2 dozen different species. Personally, I tend to think that we're probably underestimating the species diversity, if anything, and would lend towards a fairly diverse speciose division of the fossil record. Okay, so there are basically 2 ways in which we can think about the story of human evolution. I'm sure many of you will be familiar with these sort of diagrams. These are family tree diagrams, and some of which are just really quite fantastically complicated and fancy. Some of them are much more sketchy. Basically, the notion here is thinking about the human family tree in terms of descent relationships. So, Darwin's famous formulation with descent with modification. So this really stresses the descent side of things. My assessment of the situation at the moment, as far as the field is concerned, is that we don't really know a huge amount about these relationships. They're very ambiguous, and so I am going to talk to you about the alternative way of thinking about the fossil record, or looking at it along a different dimension, which is to stress the modification part or the natural selection part, and to focus on groups that appear to be similarly adapted. In other words, to focus on what I'm calling grades. And thinking about grades in human evolution, one of my colleagues, actually my PhD supervisor and I, Bernard Wood, a few years ago, we were trying to think about how we might actually reconstruct these different grades, how we might analyse these different grades in the course of human evolution from things that we can have a reasonable degree of confidence about in the fossil record. And we came up with this list, things like body size, okay, including mass and stature, locomotor behaviour, relative size of the teeth and jaws, that being linked to diet, of course, relative brain size, so some sort of proxy for behavioural complexity, and then also development. Yeah. And so what I'm going to do is sort of walk you through the human fossil record, focusing on these 5 different sets of adaptive characteristics. And basically, the message is we've essentially got 3 groups, as far as we can tell at the moment, using this sort of approach. We've got a group that I've put in grey here that doesn't really come out very well, but hopefully you can see them here. So we've got a group of 3 down here and one at the top that I think at this point I'm going to describe as uncertain. Okay. We've got a group here in this green colour that I'm going to refer to as the Australopiths, and this blue colour here that I'm going to refer to as humans. And so let's just start off with the species of uncertain status, which date back to 7 million years, potentially. Okay. And the thing to start off with here is the recognition over the last several decades that the key characteristic for hominins is bipedalism. Okay. Previously, many researchers, at least in the early part of the 20th century, were pretty convinced that increase in brain size was the key trait, and everything followed on from that. It's now very clear from the fossil record that bipedalism is the key trait. Okay. And so that is the first thing that we're sort of focusing on in terms of the anatomical characteristics looking for in the early fossils. At the moment, the question of why there should be a bipedal ape, why we should have this bipedal lineage, is pretty much an open one. Lots of hypotheses out there. We've got hypotheses that stress the benefits of carrying. We've got hypotheses that stress the benefits of having weapons and tools. We've got hypotheses that stress the efficiency benefits of bipedalism relative to chimpanzee quadrupedalism. We've got feeding hypotheses about standing up, right, and feeding from the low branch of bushes. And thermoregulation is another one, and then one that has had quite a bit of press, but I don't think very many believe in, is sort of adaptations to aquatic life, the aquatic ape hypothesis. Most of these sort of link in with this long-term drying and cooling of the climate and an opening up of the African landscape from a fairly closed sort of habitat to a much more open savanna-like one. As I say, there's a lot of discussion still going on about which of these hypotheses is most compelling. One of the things that's become a particular problem for a number of them, which link in with this cooling and drying and the open in the savanna, is that it's now clear that most of the early hominins that we have are actually found in fairly wooded environments. So linking it with an expansion of the savanna is a bit of a problem. So this is still a major point of discussion, the different hypotheses that account for the appearance of a bipedal ape, but so the agreement is that bipedalism is the key trait that we're looking for in the early hominin fossil record. And over the last 10, 15 years, there have been 3 species that have been announced that date from between, let's say, 4.5 to 7 million years. Okay, for several decades, we had no fossil record for this time period. Okay. And then in a few years, we ended up with a reasonable number of specimens that have been assigned to 3 different species. So we have Ardipithecus ramidus. It was announced in 1994 and comes from a couple of sites in Ethiopia. Early date is about 5.8 down to about 4.5. And we have a small but representative sample of fossils, including some cranial remains. So we've got some craniodental remains here, and we also have some postcranial remains. Okay, and again, this has been argued to be a hominin on the basis of characteristics that have been argued to be linked to bipedalism. Another species announced in 2001, Orrorin tugenensis, from the Tugen Hills in Kenya, dates to about 6 million years. Again, fairly fragmentary, but we have some cranial remains, and we also have some postcranial remains. And characteristics of the femur here, of the thigh bone, in particular, it's the morphology of the neck of the femur, have been argued to be indicative of bipedalism. Sorry, I should have said that one dates to 6 million. And then we also have it's sort of published the following year, 2002, this species, Sahelanthropus tchadensis, that dates to approximately 7 million years. At the moment, we don't have any postcranial remains for this, but we do have a rather wonderfully preserved cranium, from which it's been deduced after the reconstruction using computerized tomography, medical imaging techniques, that this species was also a biped. Okay. The reason I've put this in this species and the other 2 in the uncertain category is that there's still a lot of uncertainty, a lot of discussion about whether the characteristics that have been argued to be indicative of bipedalism are in fact indicative. And as these things sort of play out in the field, these 3 fossils have been found by 3 different teams of researchers, each of whom have spent quite a lot of ink arguing that the other fossils aren't hominins and theirs are. So there's this sort of 3-way conversation going on amongst these 3 groups of researchers, criticising the other group's specimens in terms of them not being hominins and suggesting they are in fact apes rather than the hominins.